Take a really good look at the image on your screen. Look at the man standing there, and then look at the sheer, terrifying size of the machine looming over him. The steel wheel he is leaning against is over 9 feet tall. The vehicle itself looks less like a military weapon and more like a piece of mining equipment from another planet. It is a giant, blocky, heavily armored behemoth of solid steel. When people think of German engineering in World War II, they usually think of the sleek Panther tank, the terrifying Tiger, or maybe the V-2 rocket. But what you are looking at right now is none of those things. It does not have a massive cannon, it is not fast, and it definitely was not sleek. This is the Krupp Räumer S. It weighed a mind-boggling 130 tons. To put that into perspective, that is the weight of 4 standard American Sherman tanks squashed into one gigantic, monstrous block. It was an absolute unit of a machine, designed for one specific, incredibly dangerous, and brutally violent purpose: to physically crush the Eastern Front into submission. Today, we are taking a deep dive into one of the most bizarre and massive wonder weapons ever built by Nazi Germany. We are going to explore why Hitler was desperate enough to order the creation of this 130-ton monster, the insane physics required to make it move, and why this terrifying machine ultimately proved to be one of the most ridiculous engineering failures of the entire war. Grab a seat, because we are going off-road. To understand why the Krupp Räumer S even exists, we have to look at the absolute meat grinder that was the Eastern Front in 1942 and 1943. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, things initially went well for them, but as the war dragged on, the Soviets adapted, and one of the most effective and terrifying adaptations was their use of landmines. The Red Army did not just lay a few mines here and there, they laid them by the millions. They created defensive lines that were miles deep, packed with highly explosive anti-tank mines. Whenever the legendary German panzer divisions tried to advance, they would drive straight into these invisible minefields. A single Soviet mine, costing a few dollars, could blow the tracks off a highly advanced, incredibly expensive German tank, leaving it stranded, helpless, and completely open to artillery fire. The German high command was panicking. Clearing minefields by hand, with engineers crawling on their stomachs, was suicide. They needed a way to punch a hole straight through these minefields so the tanks could pour through. They needed a vehicle that did not just survive mine explosions. They needed a vehicle that ate landmines for breakfast. So, in September 1942, the military approached Krupp, Germany's most famous heavy industry and steel manufacturer. The request was simple: build us a machine that can drive straight through a Soviet minefield, intentionally rolling over explosives, and come out the other side without a scratch. Krupp's engineers went to the drawing board, and what they came back with was the absolute definition of overkill. When Krupp unveiled the design for the Minenräumer, literally translated as mine clearer, it shocked everyone who saw it. First of all, there was the weight: 130 tons. Keep in mind that Germany's heaviest operational tank of the war, the King Tiger, weighed about 68 tons. The Räumer S was nearly double that. But a 130-ton solid block of steel cannot exactly steer. If you build a rigid vehicle that heavy, it is only going to go in straight lines, and if it tries to turn, the friction will rip the wheels right off the axles. To solve this, Krupp's engineers did something incredibly unique. They split the machine in half. The Räumer S was an articulated vehicle, meaning it was made of 2 completely separate halves connected in the middle by a massive, heavy-duty pivoting hinge. Think of how a modern city bus or a giant piece of construction equipment bends in the middle to make a turn. That is exactly how this 130-ton monster steered. The driver used massive hydraulic cylinders to bend the front half of the machine left or right. But dragging 130 tons across the muddy plains of Russia required an unbelievable amount of power. One engine simply was not going to cut it, so they gave it 2. Inside each half of the machine, One in the front and one in the back sat a Maybach HL90 V12 engine. These were heavy-duty engines, capable of producing 360 horsepower each. Each engine was responsible for powering just the two wheels on its half of the vehicle. This meant the driver, sitting high up in an armored cab, had to coordinate two separate massive V12 engines simultaneously just to get the giant steel block to roll forward. And then there were the wheels. Oh my God, the wheels! They were 9 feet in diameter, made entirely of solid steel. But they were not just flat circles. The wheels were fitted with massive, thick steel pads that looked like the soles of giant iron boots. These pads were designed specifically to trigger landmines. The idea was simple but brutal. The Räumer S would slowly drive into a minefield. The massive steel wheels would roll over the hidden Soviet explosives. The mines would detonate directly underneath the steel pads. But because the wheels were so incredibly heavy and the machine was so heavily armored, the explosion would just bounce off. The vehicle would absorb the blast, shrug it off, and keep rolling forward, leaving a safe, crushed path behind it for the panzer tanks to follow. It was a machine built entirely around the concept of brute force. The armor on the hull was so thick that even if a massive anti-tank mine went off, the crew sitting high up in the cabin would barely feel the shockwave. On paper, it sounded like the ultimate solution to the Soviet defensive lines. It was an unstoppable juggernaut that could pave a highway through hell. But like so many of Nazi Germany's wonder weapons, the gap between theory and reality was the size of the Grand Canyon. By 1944, a working prototype of the Räumer S was finally built and ready for testing, and it immediately became obvious that this giant steel monster was a complete and utter disaster. First, there was the issue of speed. Pushing 130 tons of solid steel across soft ground is a nightmare. The machine maxed out at a top speed of maybe 3 miles per hour. It moved at the speed of a slow walk. In a combat zone, a giant vehicle moving that slowly is not a weapon, it is target practice. Imagine being a Soviet artillery gunner, looking through your binoculars and seeing a 130-ton block of steel slowly crawling towards you like a wounded metallic turtle. It was the easiest target on the entire Eastern Front. But the speed was not even the biggest problem. The biggest problem was the very ground it was supposed to conquer. The Eastern Front was famous for the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. The Russian mud could swallow regular tanks whole. Now imagine taking a vehicle that weighs twice as much as a King Tiger tank, putting it on 4 wheels instead of tracks, and asking it to drive through that mud. The ground pressure of the Räumer S was astronomically high. The moment it drove off a paved road and onto soft soil, those massive 9-foot wheels acted like giant pizza cutters, slicing deep into the earth. The 130-ton beast would immediately bog down, sinking up to its axles in the mud. And once it was stuck, there was absolutely nothing in the German army's arsenal powerful enough to tow it out. The vehicle was also a logistical nightmare. Because of its massive size and weight, it could not cross most European bridges. It would literally crush the bridges under its own weight. It could not be easily loaded onto trains because it was too wide. So to get it to the front lines, the Germans had to disassemble it, ship the two halves separately, and then try to bolt this massive 130-ton puzzle back together in a combat zone under enemy fire. It was sheer insanity. The project was the perfect symbol of the fatal flaw in German military engineering during World War II. They were obsessed with building bigger, heavier, more complex superweapons, completely ignoring the basic realities of logistics, mass production, and physics. While the Soviet Union was stamping out thousands of simple, reliable T-34 tanks that could float over the mud, the Germans were wasting precious time, steel, and brilliant engineering minds trying to build a 130-ton mechanical dinosaur that could not even drive through a wet field. The Krupp Räumer S never saw a single day of actual combat. It never crushed a Soviet minefield. It never broke through the Eastern Front. As the war turned against Germany and the Allies closed in, the giant prototype was abandoned at a military testing facility in Hillersleben, Germany. In 1945, advancing American troops stumbled upon the facility and found the massive steel beast just sitting there. You can only imagine the look on the American soldiers' faces when they walked up to a machine with wheels taller than they were. The U.S. military took extensive photographs of the machine, marveling at the sheer absurdity of its design, before eventually having it scrapped for the metal. Today, the Räumer S is completely gone, but the photos survive, leaving us with a staggering visual reminder of desperation. It stands as a monument to what happens when brilliant engineering is driven by absolute madness. It is a story of a machine built to crush the world that ultimately collapsed under its own impossible weight. Thank you for watching. If you loved this deep dive into the weirdest machines of military history, make sure to hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and let me know in the comments what insane vehicle you want me to cover next. See you in the next video.